What makes a good ruler? Many people smarter than myself have examined this question, and George R. R. Martin is one of them, as I think one of the main themes of his series of Song of Ice and Fire is power and the ways in which it affects the people who hold it, and the way that the people who hold it affect those around them. Of course, a very famous passage from Song of Ice and Fire, and then the HBO adaptation Game of Thrones, is Varys' riddle about power being a shadow on the wall and residing where men believe that it resides. But it does tend to reside in the kings of Westeros. There have been 20 over the 300 years since Aegon the Dragon founded this nation, at least official ones. I'm not super counting claimants here, but I'll have a brief sidebar on Rhaenyra specifically. But today I thought I'd discuss the ways in which these leaders distinguish themselves from one another. In the past, I've ranked them and given my opinions on the best and the worst, but today I want to find the best and the worst in each individual ruler. I should also preface by saying all of these are my opinion, which means they are objectively correct and also your opinion, but I'd like to hear where you think you have diverging opinions in the comments down below, as I'm sure I'll miss certain things on certain kings. And I'll also note that I am keeping this to just the people who have worn the crown. There have been 20 official rulers in Westerosi history. I might add one or two claimants if I have time at the end, but we'll get to that when we get to that. There's no time for that. Up first, of course, Aegon the Dragon, the Conqueror, the person who everyone wants to see in an adaptation, probably played by Henry Cavill, even though I don't think that would be great casting. The best thing that Aegon does is not the creation of the kingdom, but it's the peace that follows his forging of the realm into one solid country. As initially, these were all independent, warring nations, essentially, and Aegon was able to take this one singular military asset, his dragons, and bind them together not just for the immediate aftermath of this conflict, but for the next 280 years going forward. His peace that he forged and the governance that he did during that time is incredibly impressive, and it's something that I really value Fire and Blood for, because we really don't have a ton on his reign until that book in 2018. So it's great to see the later parts after the conquest, which obviously we all know about the conquest. That said, his greatest weakness in my eyes is not establishing enough set in stone law for the kingdom going forward. Even the things that he concretely established weren't even necessarily concretely established by him. Visenya established the Kingsguard, so that's not really his establishment as well. And all of these things to do with the religion of Westeros and the other elements of the cultures of these varying regions that are all clashing with one another. They're all very large issues that come into play in the reigns of his successor. And I think that if he had been a little more proactive, he might have very much kind of headed those off at the pass. Also, honorable mention for good thing he did, which was ruling alongside his two sisters, who seemed to very much complement his weaknesses. I'm immediately having trouble coming up with good things to say about King Aenys the First Targaryen. He was a very kind guy, it sounds like, and I think that if I have to say one good thing about its reign, it's that all of these rebellions essentially broke out immediately after the death of his father, but he was able to deal with all of them in turn. He won the wars that he needed to win, and he rewarded the men who won them for him. He delegated there, which is good, and we'll get back around to that with his son, but overall, I think that Aenys' biggest weakness, and just biggest failing as a person as well, is really resting on his laurels in a lot of regards, and ignoring all of the fires breaking out around the realm, and expecting everyone to just fall in line because they fell in line with his father. Additionally, he's really not good at picking advisors, as picking Maegor and keeping him close to power before his exile was really a bad idea, and then allowing Maegor to just leave with Balerion and Blackfire. That's just insane. Maegor is surprisingly one of the easier kings to discuss, as he has pretty concrete good things that he does, and pretty concrete terrible, awful, horrible things that he does. Good first, we all know from the main series that the laws enacted by King Maegor on the Faith of the Seven are crucial for the state of the realm going forward, and for the stability of the Targaryen dynasty. He enacts these laws essentially saying that the Faith and the Targaryens are two parts of one realm, and that the Faith cannot arm themselves, which is a very good thing, as we see in the main series. However, Maegor does also declare war on everybody and is just generally a monster. I know I'll get some people angry in the comments for me saying that. He is a monster, probably in a literal sense, being raised from the dead after his trial by seven. But just, I mean, going America over everybody's asses is rarely a good thing in this instance. Jaehaerys is a complicated one. He's hailed by many as the greatest king Westeros ever saw, even by the author George R. R. Martin himself. And I think Jaehaerys' greatest strength lies in his ability to pick advisors and listen to them, as he surrounds himself very consistently with the best the realm has to offer, not only in his era, but in the Targaryen era in general. Having Septon Barth as his hand for a very long time, and having Queen Alysanne, probably the best queen to ever rule in Seven Kingdoms, and actually listening to both of them. Kings do not always listen to their hands, and they even less frequently listen to their wives. So, in this instance, having both be such capable advisors that he's actively taking advantage of, it's great, and it ends up being the main way Jaehaerys benefits the realm, other than roads, which people love. In terms of a greatest weakness, I've discussed this in the past, but Jaehaerys' treatment of his family is very much a shortfalling, particularly his treatment of his daughters, driving one of them to end her own life. I almost said something that would get me demonetized. I don't want to do that. But I think that that very much ties into the problems that he causes going forward, as he maybe delegates a little too much and allows others to determine his succession with the Great Council. And that leads to Viserys, which we'll get to in a second. But overall, Rhaenys was clearly a better choice. And I think that if he was maybe a little more capable of seeing his daughters and his granddaughters as capable individuals, he would be better off as a person and as a ruler. Viserys I view as kind of an anti-Tywin Lannister, but they strangely have the same effect. Starting off in reverse order for Viserys, obviously his worst trait is the war that follows his reign, because he doesn't get his ducks in a row regarding his succession, or at least concretely enough in a row to prevent a revolt by one side or the other. But I think Viserys' greatest accomplishment is keeping the peace between these obviously very hostile branches of the family for his entire lifetime. It's like Tywin Lannister, as I mentioned, as Tywin is able to hold the realm together through essentially fear of him alone, whereas Viserys is just kind of trying desperately to glue things together with good vibes. But it does work when he's alive. I'm really stretching things because there really isn't a ton to say good about Book Viserys, but overall, I think that's the closest I can come to a positive trait there. I'm going to be brief on Aegon II. He is the officially named ruler. I'm not taking a side in the whole House of the Dragon thing, whatever. It's just, according to the history books, Aegon II is on the throne. And I think his greatest strength is very much his tenacity. The fact that he's able to overcome and come through everything that he does and still be sane and capable of ruling, at least to some extent. I don't think he's a very good ruler, but he is at least capable of doing it. I think that's pretty impressive considering all that he goes through throughout the course of his war, not just what happens in season one House of the Dragon. And obviously, the worst thing is the war itself. Brief Rhaenyra sidebar, because I know I'm going to get comments. I think her greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses are tied together. I think her cause means a lot for kind of the downtrodden in Westeros, namely common-born and bastard individuals, as well as women in general, as she's able to kind of ascend some of those to higher status, specifically through the dragon seeds, and then through Rhaenyra's own ascent to queen, supposedly as well. But she kind of fails both of those ideals later on in the war. Spoiler warning for House of the Dragon, skip ahead 20 seconds if you don't want those, but Rhaenyra's turning on the bastard dragon seeds and failing to award Rosby and Stokeworth to their female heirs. It's just kind of a failing of the ideals that her war was based upon. Aegon III is an under-discussed king, and I think a lot of that comes from the mystery surrounding the greater part of his reign, as it isn't covered a ton in the world of Ice and Fire, and it is very much the end point of Fire and Blood during the first, 5 years of his reign, I believe, and we're missing about, I think, 20 after that, maybe 15. But I think overall, it is an incredible accomplishment, the degree to which he was able to bind the realm together after this massive cataclysmic Dance of the Dragons. And he was the first ruler to do it without the might of dragons behind his throne. With that said, the lacking of that might is his worst trait as a ruler. Dragons are the massive advantage the Targaryens have leveraged for so long, and he did allow them to die out under his watch. Well, yes, many of them were killed during the war. Not sending men to, say, try to go and claim Silverwing at some point was really a massive blunder on his part, despite, being understandable for trauma reasons. Daeron I, the young dragon. Don't kill me, Jon Snow, but I've never been much of a fan. Obviously, his greatest strength is being a military commander, this excellent skill at arms that allows him to take this war to Dorne and conquer it for the Targaryen dynasty finally. You need no dragon. You have a dragon. It stands before you. It's very Aegon VI, it seems like. But, I mean, similarly to Aegon VI, I don't think his chances were great. Obviously, Daeron I's worst trait was dying in this pointless war with Dorne, and frankly, starting this pointless war with Dorne, as the Targaryens tried and failed this with dragons. What makes you think you're going to succeed without them? Yes, he does succeed briefly, but I think the lasting impact is the telling factor there. Baelor is weird as well. Him and Daeron are kind of two sides of a coin. I kind of view them as the second Aenys and Maegor, just in reverse order, and neither of them being quite as bad as those two individuals. The best thing he does is all these charitable acts. In addition to building the Great Sept of Baelor, he regularly emptied the treasury in order to give to the small folk, which is very admirable. His worst trait was being insane, because he got bit by some snakes, and I think that probably impacted his brain a little bit. He did starve himself to death and refused to continue his line with his wife and appointed a boy as a High Septon. It just really was kind of chaotic for a very long time. And yeah, I think the realm probably would have fallen apart if he hadn't had such a great hand. Viserys II's greatest trait is being the best ruler that Westeros ever saw, being able to hold the realm together through the reigns of his brother and his two idiot nephews who just wanted to go to war and pray. And Viserys' only fault is dying so soon. He only ruled for a year and was maybe poisoned by his son. We'll get to that. But overall, yeah, Viserys II's the best. My first ever A Song of Ice and Fire video was about how great Viserys II was. I wouldn't recommend you watch it. It's terrible, but the sentiment is still there. But of course, the greatest trait of a leader is liking the video and being subscribed to Quinn the GM. Aegon the Unworthy is once again putting me through my paces to find a good trait. So I'll start with the bad because that is so much more obvious for him. It's so clearly the legitimization of all of his bastards. So for those who don't know, Aegon IV Targaryen had a number of children out of wedlock, all of whom were known as the Great Bastards, as while not necessarily great morally, they did some pretty impressive things. On his deathbed, he legitimized all of them and potentially gave all of them claims on the Iron Throne of Westeros. We've seen kings with a bunch of bastards before, cough, cough, Robert Baratheon, cough, cough, but there really haven't been any real succession issues caused by those bastards because they're not legitimate. Here, by making them all actual threats for the throne, he very much creates a lot of problems for all of his descendants. In terms of good traits, the realm survives the wars that he starts. That said, I really can't find much more than that, as he is very selfish, and even his early rule is dotted by just being entirely focused on his own pleasure. I really like Daeron the Good. I don't think he gets enough ink, as it were, but I do think that there's a lot to love there, not only just because his title is The Good. Daeron does a lot. He brings Dorne into the fold. I've previously credited Viserys II with that accomplishment, as it does happen because of the marriage of Daeron II to his Dornish wife, but that marriage actually happens under the reign of Viserys II, or I believe it's Baelor, but I mean, all political matters are being handled by Viserys at that point, but the fact that he was able to bring this previously hostile region into the fold without any hostility and warfare is incredibly impressive. However, I do think that his treatment of his brother, Daemon Blackfyre, is a little bit questionable. It verges on Aenys and Maegor territory in terms of allowing Maegor to be hand and wield all this power. I think ideally he might have been able to nip that problem in the bud, or if not, he might have been able to better deal with Bittersteel and his successors, as they were able to escape and keep just harassing them with wars for decades to come. King Aerys I's best and worst traits are both listening to Bloodraven, as Bloodraven is a very useful asset. He is very magically gifted and pretty much the best spy master you could possibly ask for, but he is someone who is going to instill a lot of fear in your realm, and you are not going to win any love by having this individual there. While Machiavelli does prefer fear to love, it's ideally going to be a balance of some of both, whereas Bloodraven just kind of inspires pure fear at any given point. And Aerys is just too caught up in his books to do anything other than just allow this hand to run the realm. Maekar Targaryen, Maekar, dude, where's my car? He's an interesting case, as we do actually meet him on page in the first Dunk and Egg novella, and I think his greatest strength and greatest weakness both come from this point, as I think his greatest strength is, strangely, adaptability in parenting. We see him allow his son Aegon to travel around with Duncan the Tall as a hedge knight, which does mold this future king for rule, which is very good. We'll get to that in a second. And also, he is able to kind of note that Aerion is a shitheel, and he sends him over to Lys. So, both of those good adaptations and things that I don't think many parents in Westeros would do. I think his greatest flaw was the fratricide, as I think he robbed the realm of a pretty great king. Aegon V is another pretty simple case. We know that he had a number of reforms implemented to benefit the peasants of the Seven Kingdoms. We don't really know what those reforms were, as we don't really have a ton on this era of history, both due to not having blood and fire, and Martin likely keeping this secret for future Dunk and Egg stories. His worst trait is very much allowing his children to kind of run scattershot over everything. They ruin like 20 different marriage arrangements and piss off like every great house. And also, what just occurred to me that I'd almost forgotten about is Summerhall. I don't know how I didn't write that in the script, as Summerhall ends up wiping out a ton of Targaryens in a massive fire, and he should have known better, but apparently he went a little crazy by the end. So yeah, I'd say the kids and the whole dying in a fire thing is pretty bad. If we didn't have a ton on Aegon V, we have even less on Jaehaerys II, who is just the most momentous character in all of Ice and Fire. You can tell because they didn't include him in Game of Thrones. His best trait is kind of grasping at straws, but he did end the last Blackfire Pretender. He was able to put an end to Maelys the Monstrous and end the War of the Ninepenny Kings, which was the 5th Blackfire Rebellion, which until young Griff arrives is the end of the Blackfire line, which is great and very impressive, Jaehaerys. That's just great job. I applaud you. His worst trait was listening to prophecy and forcing his children to marry one another, as we'll see that that does not end well. Yes, it results in Daenerys, who I like, but man, those kids were not happy, and that was not a good thing to do, because it drove one of them insane, maybe. Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, is obviously the worst king in the Seven Kingdoms, as he's the only one who his reign essentially ended his own dynasty. He was actively insane and alienated all possible allies. I would say the worst thing that he does personally is the execution of Rickard and Brandon Stark, Ned's brother and father, in reverse order, and obviously just something that is going to anger an entire region, and the largest region of the kingdom at that, even if they are not particularly popular. In terms of the good of Aerys II, I struggled finding anything, but it was a bit easier than certain kings like Aegon IV, as we do have a bit more on Aerys, as he is a lot more recent. Specifically, we see that early on in his reign, he's actually pretty good at listening to those who are seeking his help or coming to him with issues. He never follows through on these things, but when Rickard Stark comes south, he eventually proposes to build a new wall that will be hundreds of miles north of the current wall. While this would be impossible, it does show that he maybe thinks that the wildlings could be integrated into the realm too, which is very progressive and forward-thinking, much like his grandson Jon Snow. And additionally, he has other proposals, like he wants to declare war on the Iron Bank or build a new, better King's Landing, which, I mean, nice ideas, and I'm sure there are suggestions from his advisors, but not feasible. So, I mean, that's the best he can do, really. Fittingly, I think Robert Baratheon's greatest traits are all on display in war. The Targaryen dynasty was at a faltering point, and it was very much going to shatter given any stress at any point, and Robert took a hammer to it, and justifiably so, given the actions of the king. Not necessarily all of his outrage against Lyanna, who probably didn't like him or Rhaegar, but overall, Robert was able to take out this very toxic dynasty and install something that did allow for a very prosperous time of peace for the realm. And additionally, in war, he was able to confirm this peace and show his strength as a new regime by way of defeating the Greyjoys in Balon Greyjoy's rebellion. With that said, Robert does have a few failings. First and foremost is the number of bastards he left behind while leaving the royal line unsecured, obviously through Jaime and Cersei Lannister having kids. But I'd say that his biggest flaw is probably allowing Littlefinger to come into power, as that does very much cause the War of the Five Kings and single-handedly bankrupt the realm pretty intentionally. I'd say Joffrey's worst trait is pretty obviously starting the War of the Five Kings. And that's not a trait, but the worst thing he does is starting the War of the Five Kings by decapitating Ned Stark. And I think the best thing that he does, I'm reaching here, and it's from the show, not even the book, suggesting that the crown should have an army of its own is actually a really good idea. And I'm surprised the Targaryens didn't implement it when their dragons died out, as they do need some form of central power in order to actually command troops themselves rather than relying on their lords. I think they probably would have won the rebellion if they'd implemented that. So great job, show Joffrey. Tommen is a little sweetheart who is wonderful and has never done anything wrong in his life. His best trait is obviously wanting to ban beats, as this is just good and just law. As someone who is currently in law school, I can confirm that that should happen. But I do think that his worst trait is pretty objectively repealing King Maegor's laws. Yes, Cersei did that, but technically Tommen was the one to do that, not to lump sins of the mother in here too much, but Tommen is technically responsible for something that ends up essentially as the downfall of his family's time in power in King's Landing, as I would guess that the Sparrows are going to flock to Aegon Targaryen, who will soon join this list in the Winds of Winter, if I were a betting man. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it, and it really helps grow the channel. I'll be back in the near future with more Dunk and Egg, House of the Dragon, A Song of Ice and Fire, and Game of Thrones content, videos, analysis, discussion, all that sort of fun stuff, and I hope you'll join me for all of it. I thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you in the very near future. Goodbye, everyone.